episode 6 of Made Men. I'm Paul Whitcomb, and I'm here with Ray Franz.
Thanks for having me.
Today we have something truly special for you, and we're sponsored by Rides, Chuck Zito's whiskey, which you can find at ridesusa.com, and we're very appreciative for having them online with us. Today, something truly special. Author Gus Russo, the author of 3 of my favorite books, among many other things that he's done. Mr. Russo, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Really, truly special. Now this pressure's on, right?
I think you're up for it. I have to tell you right away that back in the 90s when I was doing the mob trials, Carlisi and some of these others, I got into it from that. And I wondered, how did you, being an investigative journalist, decide I'm going to write the definitive history of the outfit that's meticulously researched as a historical reference? How did you get into that, and how much work were you facing?
Well, thanks for asking. Not being from Chicago, it wasn't easy to do the meticulous research. But let's see. It was funny. I've done a lot of documentaries for the networks. All the biggies, Brokaw and Peter Jennings and all those guys. Dan Rather, Frontline. I did a big show for Frontline. Anyway, I was doing mostly documentaries, and every subject I was touching on seemed to mention Chicago in a big way. Like if you looked at Judith Exner, if you looked at the plots against Castro, if you looked at the Kennedys, certainly with a merchandise mart, you got back to Chicago, of course. If you looked at Hollywood, Lou Wasserman and Universal and MCA, well, those guys all came from Chicago. So I'm saying, why doesn't somebody just do a book about Chicago and be done with it? And so that's what I did, or I tried to do. And it is amazing how many things intersect with the Chicago mob that aren't really public knowledge. It should be. That's how I got into it. Just, sort of stream of consciousness. One thing leads to another.
In the opening of Deadly Associates, which was the beautiful documentary of the life of Joey Seifert's dad and the outfit, it opens with the unfortunate scene of me saying, in the 60s and 70s, Chicago was the epicenter of organized crime in the United States. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think it was. I mean, when you look at the big competition, of course, was New York, but New York was so busy fighting amongst the 5 families, getting all the headlines. In my take, they had this brilliant strategy to take over labor. And when you do that in those days, people today don't understand, but in those days, if you had the Teamsters, you had about 20 states in your back pocket. If you had IATSE, the theatrical union, and so it was a genius move. And the other organized crime gangs weren't really stretching out like that. This was a bold move on the part of people like Murray Humphreys and so forth to really. They had local labor, of course, in the old days, but they said, let's just go national and get the Teamsters in our back pocket and get the theatrical stuff. And so, to me, they were the center because they had inroads in at least 15 or 20 states during those years.
It reminds me of that old story about the IATSE meeting that I think was in Nashville or Louisville when...
In Louisville, Kentucky.
Okay, and the outfit, it's been rumored that the outfit sent gunmen to that meeting and said, you're going to vote for our guy. Do you think that's historical?
Oh, there's so many things that point to it, so many sources on it. I totally believe it. That's how they got George Brown in to run it. And my memory is that there were a lot of sources, including FBI, that they went there with gunmen and said, here's your new boss of the theatrical union. And then once they had that, the game was on. It was a crazy, bold move, but I do believe that happened.
Well, it was certainly something we could talk about for a couple of hours. We've talked about a couple of different stories in 90 seconds with you. You mentioned Murray Humphreys and his idea to expand into labor. You've mentioned the takeover of IATSE, which we talk about, the Hollywood scandal, which led to the jailing of of the entire upper echelon of the mafia, which would open the door for Tony Accardo and then Sam Giancana. And it seems like there are so many layers to the outfit that we really should schedule about 8 to 10 episodes just to cover a few chapters of your book. Is that fair?
No, there are a lot of layers, but essentially, if you had to start in a pyramid, it's all built on labor, in my opinion. You can start. Everything makes sense if you go back to unionism and sweetheart deals with corporations, and that's where their power really came from. So it's complicated in some ways, but it's a simple, basic strategy. But to be clear, the mob certainly dealt with labor, with unions earlier than the outfit came in, but it was very localized, and from what I can tell, going national was a big thing. Also, jukeboxes. The Chicago was manufacturing jukeboxes with the outfit, and they got sent all over the country, which helped them control the music business. Tony Accardo literally would put his friends' kids' records in the national jukeboxes so they could have a hit. If you knew Tony Accardo, and there's a couple famous versions of that story where people became nationally famous because Tony Accardo's plumber had a daughter with a a record, and so he made sure it was in the top position in every jukebox.
And
It actually made it into my novel.
Yes, it did. I
It actually
remember
made it
that.
into my novel.
Yeah, that
I
did.
get into that a
so
little
yeah,
bit in
yeah,
my
the music
novel, Gus.
Business, the movie business, they knew entertainment was a huge moneymaker. During the Depression, one of the few businesses that still made money was movies, entertainment. The Marx Brothers, there you go, they got rich during the 30s because people would hoard their last nickel to go to a movie just for solace. And so Hollywood was kind of immune to the things that everybody else was going through. So they said, hey, let's get into Hollywood. So it was brilliant stuff, actually.
Unfortunately, it all turned out pretty badly for the outfit. What do you think was the mistake when they put in George Brown, Willie Byoff? These guys were not extremely slick racketeers, but they were all of a sudden put in a very sensitive position.
Yeah, well, Byoff was the weak link in the chain, I think, and maybe another guy or two. But it reminds me of Tony Spilotro in Las Vegas, like 30 years later. You have one weak link who's sort of out of control, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. And I can't remember the details now. It's been a long time, but he was doing his own side extortion racket that sort of got out of control and brought the heat on the whole thing. But the thing was, it didn't bring down the outfit. It brought down, half a dozen key members, but they still moved along. In fact, as you know from the book, through their connections, they got an early parole, for all those guys, and it was back to business as usual, because that was the other thing that Humphreys and these guys specified: we have to control politics at the same time. So they bought politicians, and so nothing really stuck. Any big prosecutions didn't last because they could just buy their way out with a politician. In this case of the Hollywood parole, it was Truman, President Truman. He was under the whole wing of the Pendergast machine, which answered to Chicago.
I know you have been reading quite a bit lately about something called Pendergastism.
And so few people understood that. When we think about Harry Truman, we think about the buck stops here and the corn-fed, homegrown, honest politician. And the thread that runs through your books, the outfit, super mob, is the incredible influence that the Chicago outfit had at the highest levels of national politics. Tom Clark, Ramsey Clark, parole board, even the United States Supreme Court. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things I learned that blew me away, sometimes one sentence will crystallize the power. And Jean Humphreys, Murray's widow, who I was fortunate to find, and nobody had spoken to her, she kept a journal, and she had a great memory of everything that took place because she insisted on being in the middle of everything. That was her thing with Humphreys. And she told me how Curly often went to Hyannisport to hang out with Joe Kennedy. And I said, okay, and then the time, as you know, about when Murray Humphrey's daughter needed a date for this high school dance, and Curly said, "Who do you want?" And she said, "Oh, Frank Sinatra." Okay, and there's a picture in my book of Sinatra at her prom, and just a couple of things like that crystallize the kind of power that they had, the highest echelons. Joe Kennedy came to them when he wanted assurance that his son would win the 60 election. He knew where the power was. If they had, again, if they had labor, you sort of had to go to them for everything. And whether you were President Truman and Truman did go to them, according to the sources I spoke to. And so, yeah, it's so big that they even had their guy, Clark, put on the Supreme Court, as you say. Yeah, I don't remember all the details of that right now, but the fact is, they could get to a president of the United States very easily. They shared girlfriends with JFK. What more, do you have to know? So if they could get to the president, you can assume they could get to everybody beneath that. Who was it? Marty Underwood, who was an aide to Mayor Daley, told me a story. I can't remember if I put it in that book or a Kennedy book, but it's a funny story. Underwood was in Daley's office the night of the 1960 election, and stop me if you've heard this one, but Daley was, of course, helping Joe Kennedy in the outfit with vote totals. And when Marty was sitting there, a guy came in to report the vote totals from one cemetery, and 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 he said, "Oh, well, Mr. Mayor, we've got 530 votes from this cemetery on the north side," and Daley fumed. He said, "530 votes." He said, "There's like 700 or 800 people buried there. I know that. We checked it out." And he said, and the guy said, "Well, Mr. Mayor, a lot of the tombstones have been pushed over, and we couldn't get the names." So Daley said, "Get back there and turn those things over. Those people have as much right to vote as the other people."
It's the Chicago way.
It is. Vote early, vote often.
So,
You can't overestimate the amount of power they had for a certain period. Literally, for about 30 years, every president was aware of these guys.
It seemed like to me Chicago knew that whatever the cost of political capital is, it's worth it. It really seemed like from the 40s and late 30s, a lot of their money went toward political capital, especially, I mean, and for the Chicago Heights guys, I mean, they totally controlled Cal City. Like the mayor, all the police chief, and all 15 police officers. So it just like Chicago knew to be really effective and to have a long career, political capital, whatever its cost, is worth it.
Well, that's one thing people don't talk about enough, because they were paying off so many people, judges, cops, whatever, and politicians, that Accardo had a big nut to meet every month. And so people would say, well, when they died, where's all the money? Well, there wasn't a lot of profit because there were so many payoffs going out, out the door. I don't know how much money. Now, Humphreys and his widow would have talked about all the money that ended up in Switzerland, because they were currying. Gene Humphreys told me about how they were taking tons of money to Swiss bank accounts. So some of it went there, some of it ended up buried in backyards, of course, and whatever. But they had a huge overhead with all these payoffs. And I think that's why the skim was so important in Las Vegas, to take care of that. Yeah, the payoffs were huge. I mean, they owned this. Somebody told me at some point they owned half the Chicago Police Department, just lock, stock, and barrel. One of the cops who wrote a tell-all book, what was his name? He talked about how Sam Giancana used to encourage young boys to join the police department, and we'll buy you your first outfit and everything, your first uniform, and go join, and then we'll take care of you, and you take care of us. It was just a joke how many of these guys they controlled. So, long-winded answer, but basically the payoffs were huge.
So the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s and into the 80s, they've got this enormous influence over not only American politics, but American culture.
Oh, for sure. You know, they helped the movies get made, as you know, from the Super Mob book. That was Korshak's specialty, is greenlighting movies. You know, he would say which ones got made and which ones didn't very often, based on the fact that if he and the Chicago boys didn't like the topic, they could shut it down with a strike with IATSE or the Teamsters. And, you know, Lou Wasserman at MCA Universal, his first call when he was making a new movie was to Sydney to make sure the boys in Chicago were happy. And if they weren't happy, the movie didn't get made. Or, you know, the money was, they charged so much for extortion that they couldn't afford to make the movie. So, yeah, they affected culture. It's just crazy how many things they touched. Major movies, you know, the James Bond franchise.
Really?
That Cubby Broccoli, the producer, was Sidney Korshak's neighbor and close friend. And a lot of those deals were done through him, including who were the actors in the movies. You remember that story from the Korshak book about how when Cubby was going to do Diamonds Are Forever in Vegas, well, Vegas, the mob owned it. Yeah, so Sidney said, "Oh, great, Cubby, you're a buddy. Won't be any problem. You can have Mike place the Riviera for all your interior scenes." And they did. They used the Riviera for that movie. And as they're ending the conversation, Sidney said, "Oh, just one more thing. My girlfriend's the star."
And yeah, and his mistress.
At the time was Jill St. John, and that's how she got the role. Now, I interviewed Natalie Wood's sister, Lana Wood, who had been hired to be the lead. And she said, "Oh, now I understand what happened. I wondered what happened. All of a sudden, I was knocked down to a lower role and I got killed halfway through the movie." She didn't know the deal that was made for Jill St. John. So, and Jill became a star. So, yeah, they had a lot of control in culture and music, movies, you name it. When you had the jukeboxes, which were a big thing for about 30 or 40 years, when you controlled jukeboxes, you had music pretty easily, and all the clubs in Vegas that they owned, all the showrooms, you know. So it's crazy. It's sort of hard to believe, actually, that they were able to pull this off for so long.
Well, and that famous subplot in The Godfather with Johnny Fontaine and getting the movie roles, and I mean, that reflected maybe more of New Jersey and Moretti and Sinatra, but that was very much the reality with Chicago's influence as well, right?
Oh, of course. And that's, again, in my Korshak Super Mob book, I have a lot of that, the making of The Godfather. I'll tell the story, although you guys, I'm sure, know it. Maybe your viewers don't. When Coppola decided he was on board to direct it, he insisted on getting this new young actor named Pacino, who hadn't really done, but I think maybe one movie. But he insisted, "I have to have him. He's the guy. He's going to play Corleone." And trouble was, he was under contract to a rival studio. The movie was being made by Bob Evans at Paramount, and MGM had Pacino. And the owner of MGM hated Bob Evans at Paramount and was not going to let his boy's contract go. And they'd been developing this movie all year at great expense, and they still couldn't get Pacino, and Coppola wouldn't do it without Pacino. And this is from Bob Evans. He tells this story, by the way. Bob calls Sidney. Says, "Sidney, we're going to start shooting in a month, and we haven't got our lead actor. We're spending millions of dollars." And Sidney says, "What's his name?" He says, It's Al Pacino." Again, Sidney didn't know. He writes it out on a napkin. "How do you spell that? P-A." Yes. And he says, "Okay, who's got his contract?" He said, "MGM." He said, "Okay, I'll get back to you in a little while." Just a few minutes later, he calls Bob Evans back and says, "You got him." And Evans said, "How in the world did you pull this off?" He said, "Well, Kirk Kerkorian, owns MGM. And at the time, he was building the MGM Grand, the largest hotel in the world, I think. And Korshak called him up and said, 'My friend Bob Evans wants your guy at Pacino.' And Kerkorian says, 'Tell Bob Evans him.'" And Sidney says, "Okay, you want to play that way?" He says, "I hear you're building a new hotel." Kerkorian says, "Yeah, what the fuck is your business?" Sidney says, "Well, do you want to see it get completed? Because they own the construction union." And then son of a bitch, he slammed the phone down and he gave him Pacino, and that's how that happened. So yeah, they had other parts in the Godfather too, with unions in New York. Sidney had a lot of control over movies. There was one shot in Boston. Was it called The Heist? A big Dino De Laurentiis movie that Sidney took care of the unions for that one, and yeah, so a lot of movies that you wouldn't think necessarily they were. Sidney never had his name on credits. I don't think he wanted this, but he should have been on about 25 or 30 movies.
Well, so few of us really understand who Sidney Korshak was, and you've written an entire book about him and Wasserman and MCA. Can you give our viewers a quick rundown of who Sidney Korshak was and what his connection with Chicago was?
Yeah, well, he came from Chicago. He was raised there, and he went to law school. He wanted to become a lawyer, and now there's rumors that the Capone organization paid for his law school. It's hard to prove something like that, but certainly a lot of people believe it. When he gets out of law school, now you have to understand, I had to do a whole digression on the Jews in Chicago because there was a lot of discrimination against Italians, Jews, whatever, different kinds of discrimination. Among other things, the Jewish lawyers couldn't join the bar. They just were, kept out. And they couldn't get the big corporation contracts, and they were relegated usually to door-to-door credit people, looking for bad credit problems and just minor stuff. Not the only way, but one of the only ways a Jewish lawyer could succeed would be representing the boys, the outfit. So that offer was made to Korshak, and he took it. When he got in, right out of law school, he came under the wing of Murray Humphreys, who was the labor guy. And they saw Sidney as the fair-haired boy. The mob always wanted Jewish lawyers because they were good, and Jewish accountants, Jewish money people. And he was very suave, well-dressed, well-spoken, and he could mix with the corporate people. So eventually, after doing a lot of things in Chicago with Curly, he was dispatched out to Hollywood to be their boy there, to deal with all the studio heads. And, when productions would start, literally they would call Sidney and ask what the number was going to be, what the cost was going to be to the outfit. And he'd say, let me call Chicago and I'll call you back. And this happened almost on a daily basis. He would call Accardo in New York and say, hey, my friend Lou Wasserman's shooting a new movie, and the budget's around $3 million. What's it going to cost him for a labor piece? And Joe would say, oh, he's a friend of yours, maybe 50,000. So he'd call Lou back, say, Lou, 50,000, no problem. And Lou would happily write a check. That was Curly's job, to be the phone operator between Hollywood and Chicago. And he was real good at it. Plus, he also was a problem solver for the celebrities who ran into problems, legal problems. He could fix those things and take care of that. And he would call Chicago Muscle out to take care of anybody who was bothering a celebrity. And there was a story I was told, I don't think I put it in the book because I couldn't double source it, but the source was good, that a very famous singer, her son was in huge hock to a couple bookies. He had bad gambling debts for Vegas or whatever. And Sidney said, I'll take care of it.
Let's see you try and take this away.
And because he liked the celebrity very much. And there were two bookies who promptly disappeared off the face of the earth. That's the kind of favors he could do if he liked you. So, yeah, I could go on forever. It's a ridiculously big story. But that was Sidney's job, to be pretty much their Hollywood. And in Vegas, he oversaw 4 or 5 casinos in Vegas at the same time. He was back and forth between Hollywood and Vegas. He was at the Riviera for the most part.
One of the names that pops up in Supermob that surprised me, that probably shouldn't, through MCA, was Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Well, Ronnie, boy, there's a story. my friend Dan Moldea wrote a great book about Ronald Reagan, which I highly recommend. Was that Dark Victory? Yeah, Dark Victory.
Yes,
and he wrote it while Reagan was president. That took a lot of cojones, I got to tell you. You know, just a complete destruction of him. Anyway, Reagan was his career was boosted by Jules Stein and the MCA organization in Illinois.
Is this true? That's his story. I just got lost and wandered in here.
And when he went west, went to Hollywood, he, after becoming a snitch, a commie snitch on fellow actors and directors for the FBI, he gave testimony turning in people who were innocent people. He at one point ran for the president of the Screen Actors Guild in the early 50s. And the Chicago guys made sure that he won first. And he subsequently did favors for Lew Wasserman, who was his big benefactor. Lew Wasserman ran Universal and MCA. What he did was he gave a waiver to Universal so they could represent actors and make movies at the same time, which is a total conflict of interest, totally illegal now. And it was illegal then, but he gave a waiver to one union or one studio, the one that was controlled by Chicago.
$1,000 apiece. Your project. Your money.
Lew Wasserman, Jules Stein. They got the deal, and that's how Universal became so big. Well, they paid Ronald Reagan off by giving him TV shows. And they built his career. That was the big payoff for Reagan, letting Universal become a monolith. Okay? I hope that registered. That was a lot of stuff there, but essentially Reagan helped Universal. Universal then helped Reagan, but it was all interwoven with Chicago. It's just amazing. And then the payoff came even further when they boosted his career as a politician when he ran for governor. Wasserman and all those guys backed him. And he was close friends with Sidney Korshak. Reagan was his whole life. They were always at parties together, and Reagan sat at his table at the Bistro restaurant in Beverly Hills, which Korshak owned. And B. Korshak and Nancy Reagan were friendly. It's crazy. The point is they could get to Ronald Reagan. One of the things he did as president was he practically destroyed the organized crime strike force, which was a great boost to the gangsters. He took Sidney Korshak's name out of the California organized crime directory. His buddy Sidney, his name came out. And he was probably the biggest organized crime guy in California, but his name wasn't in the book. And so, yeah, it's a great story that's largely unknown about the Gipper. And whenever I see him toasted by everybody, the great Ronald Reagan, I think, read my book, please.
So Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Reagan, all connected.
Yeah, they all, because Chicago was so powerful, you just couldn't move without them on your side. And it's not like every president was crooked, but they knew where the power was, And there was a time that people couldn't relate to right now, but there was a time where you really needed the Teamsters backing, because when they said we're voting for Kennedy, that was a lot of sway the locals had over their union members. So when they said we're backing Kennedy, that got you a lot of votes, not just in Illinois, all over. And that doesn't exist anymore. When they broke up international labor, like the Teamsters, and then government took over, a lot of that kind of power went away.
Sure. I have to pivot for a second to something else, and that is President Kennedy's killing. I had an experience where I was a federal law clerk during one of the big mob trials of the 90s. Lenny Patrick, that name probably rings a bell with you, was the testifying witness. And his attorneys came in and said, look, we have this Cuban documentary that says Lenny Patrick was the gunman on the grassy knoll. And in order to go through that, the judge assigned me to go through all the sealed Kennedy files that were organized crime related. And I came away with an impression that the outfit didn't do this. And if they did do it, they were brilliant about covering it up. And then when your book came out, I had to hold my breath till I got to the end. And I'm wondering if now that everything's been released, do you feel a sense of satisfaction? Do you feel that there's more yet to be talked about? Or is this finally case closed?
Well, boy, it's a tricky question. I've written 3 books on that case, and I've done probably more than a dozen documentaries. So I interviewed thousands of people over 30 or 40 years for that story. And bottom line, Oswald did it. There was no grassy knoll shooter. So if you're asking, the case is closed about the shooter for sure. Because the forensics, the ballistics, there's a mountain of evidence against him, including flight from the scene of the crime. Nobody else fled except Oswald. And any cop will tell you, flight is one of the top indicators of guilt, right? He leaves the depository. An hour later, he executes a Dallas cop, shoots him 4 times, point blank. Gee, what a coincidence. The guy who owned the rifle, worked in the depository, flees the scene of the crime, kills a cop. Oh, he's just a CIA agent. He had nothing to do with it. Yeah, right. He did it. And every cop in Dallas knew he did it. I knew all those guys. They said they knew right away who killed Kennedy when they found out who killed the cop. And so he did it. Now, the only way you can have a mob connection or a CIA connection or whatever to him is to look at his links, and he had none. This guy, it sounds, stereotypical and simplistic to say, but he was the ultimate loner. We went over his life with a fine-tooth comb. He had no friends, no contacts. His address books didn't have friends or associates' names. It was just jobs he was looking for or whatever, or an FBI agent's name who was bothering his wife. He had nothing. And he never assimilated into any place that he lived. He moved constantly. Since he was a child, he moved. His mother moved him, I think, 14 or 15 times before he was in high school, because they were always running away from authorities who wanted to separate his mother from him. So he was born to be a loner. So it's hard to pin anybody who might have wanted to kill Kennedy to Oswald. You have to pin him to the shooter. When we did the Frontline show in '93, Who Was Lee Harvey Oswald? It's a big project. We spent a year and a half, 2 years on that and interviewed people all over the world. We started out with the idea, let's keep an open mind about who did it. And we said, let's figure out who shot President Kennedy first. If we can figure that out, it makes our task a lot easier about this story, about the assassination, and we can work backwards from the shooter. After just a couple of 3 months, we came to the conclusion, interviewing all the ballistics and forensics experts, that Oswald did it. And said, okay, now we work backwards from him and see, and he touched nobody. He was not hired by anybody. Now, there's one exception, which is why I wrote the books that I wrote. He spent a week in Mexico basically hanging out with Cuban intelligence and Soviet intelligence. Comes back 7 weeks later, he kills Kennedy. There's a lot of smoke and maybe fire around what was going on in Mexico. We've learned a lot more since then. Not that the Cubans or the Soviets hired Oswald, but we think, I'm pretty sure, he told the Cubans what he planned to do. And so they knew ahead of time. That was the kind of conspiracy of silence. They knew what was going to happen, in my conclusion. So, but that's it. He wasn't hired. The mob, you guys are experts on this. Did the mob ever kill a big politician, a president, a mayor, a governor? It's not something they do because it brings the heat, right? They didn't even kill cops. There's probably an exception there. I could be wrong, but they didn't. They stayed away from politicians and cops and judges. And the other thing is, the mob kind of liked JFK. Saying, yeah, I interviewed friends of Sam Giancana, and they said, why would we kill him? We liked it. We partied with him in Vegas. We wanted to be him. Why would we kill JFK? And but you have to start with the shooter and see who he was connected to. And he was connected to nobody.
That's all the time we have for episode 6 of Made Men with Gus Russo. please join us for episode 7, where we talk some more with Mr. Russo.